Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk to you about how we begin to pull all of this together. We've been learning a bunch of science content in the videos with Bob and in our synchronous sessions, and we've learned a little bit about visual art and how visual communication works. We've built our Accordion book. I want to begin to talk about how we pull all of that together for your students that you're working with. We are learning all of this science content and all of this art content so that we can mentor our students through the process of making a poster in response to one of our 3 challenge questions. I want to talk directly about some ways in which you might be able to mentor your students towards that goal. I want to talk to you about 2 specific techniques you can use when working with your students in the Accordion book to move them from the science content that we've been learning to addressing the challenge questions. The 2 techniques that we're going to use are mind mapping and thumbnail sketches. Mind mapping is a simple methodology for beginning to visualize the interconnectedness of ideas, and it is a great tool for helping students grow their ideas. We're going to pair that with thumbnail sketches. Thumbnail sketches are tiny little drawings that allow you to simply, quickly, and efficiently visually express an idea without getting fussy or worrying about it being a finished work of art. It's a way of ideating and iterating, or trying out a bunch of different ways of representing a single thing. So for this example, we're going to use the challenge question, how do severe storms form? And we are going to break that question apart and show how we can begin to grow our ideas around that question. I like to use white when I'm working in a brown book for questions versus black for statements or facts. It's one of the easy ways that I can begin to see in my book every time I'm asking a question. Use any color that you feel comfortable, but it's a great strategy to begin to use some kind of a coding system to differentiate different kinds of information in your book. We have our challenge question. How does a severe storm form? Bob has already introduced us to the science behind how a severe storm forms. Now it's time to get our students to begin to give visual form to what does a severe storm look like? How do we represent the formation of a severe storm? And there are as many correct answers as there are students attempting to answer it. So how do we empower our students to find their answer? I want to use a combination of mind mapping and thumbnail sketches to drive the ideation process and to get our students thinking expansively about ways in which they might be able to answer this question, rather than defaulting to their first instinct or their first impulse. There is my new question that I need to answer in order to begin to make a poster in response to this question. Before we go any further, I want to make some room to get expansive. I want to help guide my students through the process of generating as many responses to this question as I possibly can. And so I have pre-cut a bunch of sheets of paper at 6 inches by 12 inches that I can use to expand around this central idea. And that's what I want to take a second to do right now. What I've got right now is a nice little folded packet of pages that open up like a flower bloom. I've recopied my question in the exterior of my flap so that I can see that question when I come here. Now I can open up my book and I have lots of room to begin to brainstorm. I have my question at the center. What do severe storms look like? In this brainstorming phase, we want to encourage our students to grow their ideas, but we want to make sure that they're growing their ideas in ways that help them to answer the question. So at this point, one of the next questions I might ask my students is, what kinds of severe storms can you think of? What kinds of severe storms do you know about? And we'd get them to begin by generating the names or the kinds of severe storms that they are aware of. I'm going to add a branch for every new kind of severe storm that I can think of, and I'm going to try to think of as many different kinds of severe storms as I possibly can. We've got around our central idea, we've got a ring of possible kinds of severe storms. The next phase is to get them to think about how can they begin to draw or represent those storms. One of the things I might do next is ask my students which of these are the most exciting or the most interesting to you, and ask them to pick one color and draw a circle around the kinds of storms that they think are going to be the most interesting or exciting to try to draw. Tornado, hurricane, and thunderstorm are the ones that I'm most interested in. By getting your students to start with a mind map, we've expanded their ideas and their thinking about as many different kinds of storms as possible. And then we've asked them to sort of narrow that list back down so that they can explore some visuals to coincide with a few of them, and so that they're not having to draw responses to every single kind of storm. When we were generating our mind map, we wanted to use short, simple words to get our ideas out quickly and to map them across our paper efficiently. At this point, we want to begin to do the same kind of thing for our visual thinking. So we're going to use a technique called thumbnails. Artists and designers use thumbnails to rapidly run through a whole range of ideas without wasting a ton of time, a ton of materials, or a ton of space. In an earlier video, we talked about some of the elements of visual communication. I'm going to put that list of those elements on the screen now to remind you of what they are, and what we want to do is encourage our students to make use of these when answering that question, what do severe storms look like? So how can they use line? How can they use color? How can they use shape in order to give visual form to this question? We're going to expand our mind maps using thumbnail drawings. In essence, we're going to ask our students to explore 3 different ways that they could draw each kind of storm. And this way we get them generating multiple ideas around how they can use the visual elements to draw that storm. Rather than guiding our students towards one singular answer, we want to continue to allow them to be expansive and expressive with the way that they think about how they can represent severe storms. So you may actually want to rephrase the question or develop smaller sub-questions to get them thinking in different ways about this. So some of the kinds of questions we can ask our students to get them to think about how they're using the visual elements to give form to severe storms is, how could we use line to draw rain? Would you draw fast lines or slow lines? Long lines or dotted lines? What color lines would you use to draw rain? What direction would you draw those lines? And I might ask, what do severe storms feel like? By asking, what do severe storms feel like, you might get a totally different set of visual responses. So one of the strategies to empower your students to draw on their personal ideas is to anchor it in their own experiences, their own memories, and their own associations or feelings with severe weather. When students are making images, they are making a series of choices about how to use those elements of visual communications. After your students have had a chance to brainstorm their ideas in their accordion book, it's important to return back to the challenge question. Ultimately, all of the artistic decisions that they're making are in service of that challenge question, and that challenge question encourages them to integrate both art and science. Really, what we're asking of our students is, how can we use what we've learned about art and science to create a poster or an image that answers the question, how does a severe storm form? Before I wrap this video up, I want to take a second to show you some examples from the art world and the ways that other artists have dealt with showing us what a severe storm could look like. So let me take this camera over to the computer and we can take a look at some examples together. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. Let's start with this one here. These ideograms and pictograms depict flood zones, and you can see that they rely heavily on minimal color. There is some blue in the one on the right-hand side. We use lines and some repetition of lines, specifically wavy lines. We use a simple bold silhouette of a house or a car or a cloud or raindrops. We have some degree of variation in the bottommost one here, where we can see that there are the curving lines that make up the waves are slightly offset. In each of these cases, the orientation and the scale of the objects help to further the illusion of flood. What I mean by that is that the water is overlapping the house form in every single one of these, and that the water occupies a significant portion of the real estate in the image area. Let's compare that to something like this piece by Ludolf Backhuizen, a Dutch master painting of 3 ships in a storm. And again, let's talk about it in terms of the way that they're using the elements of visual communication. You can see that there's a huge shift in color from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of this image, where things are warm on the left and very cool and dark on the right. We have a very deep, dark foreground and a bright white mid-ground in this painting to draw attention to those sort of crashing waves. The shapes that are being used here are all jagged in the foreground. The waves are jagged, the rocks are jagged, and it furthers that feeling of sort of a aggressive energy of a storm. In terms of scale, the ships are relatively small in comparison to the clouds, the sky, and the rocks, making them feel vulnerable in this context. Now, let's contrast that with this scene here by Turner, which depicts essentially the same exact content as the last image, a ship in a storm at sea. And here we can see a very different approach to the way that he's rendering that storm. Here, this painting is focused far more on the expression of what it feels like to be in the midst of the storm, rather than what it looks like to be in the midst of the storm. In terms of color, everything is muted and dark here. Our lines, there are no sharp, crisp lines. Everything is fuzzy and blurry, giving you the feeling that you're in the midst of that whirling and whipping storm. There's a ton of repetition. The same kind of mark is being repeated over and over again in order to give that feeling of wind and rain whipping around you. There's some variation from light to dark. The scale of things in here, you can barely make out the ship's mast, which is the lone sort of crisp line in the middle of this frame, making the ship feel engulfed by the storm at sea. The sky and the ocean tend to blend together. In the midst of the storm, any feeling of a horizon line is totally lost. And if you've ever been caught in an extreme downpour, you know how hard it can be to see more than 10 feet in front of your face. So this painting by Albert Bierstadt is a storm in the Rocky Mountains, and you can see that he's taken a much more realistic approach or representational approach. In this image, things look like what they are. You can still see that we're using really dark, muted, aggressive colors in the background to indicate the rolling in of that storm. Those dark values in the background also help to push that space back. If you remember back to the color wheel, that's when we were looking at the shades of color. Those are colors plus black, and when you start to do that, it pushes those colors back into the background. On top of that, the background is a cool blue, helping it to recede even further. The midground has that golden shaft of light cutting through it, and he's using color to help us understand that the sun is illuminating that small swath of the landscape while the storm looms on the horizon. The landscape takes up about 50% of this image, and the other 50% of this image is dedicated to sky. We are meant to be overwhelmed by both the storm and the land that it is crossing, and in order to make that happen, all of the trees are teeny tiny, which makes us feel like we're looking at a really long distance. So he's using the scale of the trees to reinforce this feeling of distance across a landscape. Next is this image by Georgia O'Keeffe. It's a drawing that she's made, and you can see here that color is predominantly blue. It feels like it's all drawn on a blue ground, but the warm colors in the foreground help to protrude that forward. The blue in the mountain range helps to push that to the back, and the way that she's using white on a blue ground really allows her to use those repeated white strokes to create the illusion of clouds. There's not a tremendous use of big bold shapes here, and instead we see an accumulation of small marks that start to amass into larger things. Rather than drawing every single blade of grass or totally filling in every inch of the cloud, she's using a small set of lines to signify a much larger object. So really that speaks to the way that she's using repetition of line and variation of line in order to suggest more than she's actually drawing. I think that you can see that echoed in Van Gogh's classic Starry Night, where the way that he's using a combination of color and line in the background and the blue and yellow colors create a feeling of wind whipping through a dark starry night. The repetition and variation of that same mark over and over and over again create that feeling of movement in the sky. One of the other big tricks that Van Gogh uses in this particular image is scale. That very large tree in the foreground helps us to set up a sort of relationship to the sky, and we feel like we're standing on a hillside looking down over the city with the sky off in the background. In this piece by Julie Mertu, again we can see something that feels storm-like while not actually looking like a literal storm. Abstraction is a totally valid way to give form to the ideas around the energy that exists inside of storm systems and the collision of hot and cold air. So here you're looking at a kind of storm that is being made that does not resemble rainstorms that we have seen with our eyes, but it might more evoke the feeling of a storm, the churning energies at work in a storm. There's a combination of warm and cool colors that are used rather chaotically and explosively. Line is one of the dominant forms of expression that lends movement in this particular piece. This piece by Natalie Maybach shows you a sculptural approach to dealing with data from weather systems, and you can see here that she is using an abundance of color that sort of swirls and rises around a central explosive uprising. You can see a repetition of spherical form, and you can see her varying that in the top third of this sculpture. You can see a whole range of shapes that she's using here and linear elements that she is combining to create this sort of whirling vortex kind of feeling. This image uses line, color, and shape to help us understand wind speed over the land. In terms of point of view, we're looking from the top down, and we're using color to represent varying degrees of speed. The more warm and dark the color is, the faster the wind speed is. The cooler the color gets, the slower the wind speed. And you can see we have a key across the bottom. So this image uses a repetition of line, it uses color symbolically, and it overlays it over a set of shapes that we know and recognize in the map of the United States.